Welcome back to the Movement Professional Podcast. I'm Dr. Chris Leib. So today I'm going to do another short podcast regarding a topic that I think is a pretty important topic. It's sort of a philosophy within the health and fitness world that I find to be of utmost importance, and also a common misconception that leads to confusion and often leads to poor results when looking at trying to get out of pain, trying to improve fitness, trying to improve behaviors. So the title of the podcast will be Continuum-Based Thinking. Another way to look at this is process-oriented thinking. This is going to be contrasted to a entity-based type of thought process or finite inherent judgment-based thinking. To define a continuum, it is a coherent whole that is characterized as a collection, sequence, or progression of values that are varying by minute degrees. Right? So another way to think of this, another term that gets thrown into this idea is a spectrum. So we have certain things that are at the extremes that we could talk about, but then most of the real world kind of lies within a continuum or a spectrum of those binary kind of endpoints. But oftentimes in really important things, we understand that there is a spectrum of many things. We understand that there is a continuum of things, but it's the idea kind of gets lost in a lot of conversation, and we start to talk about things at the extreme, or we start to really define things as good or bad, or we just define things as specific entities. And there's going to be three places that, at least in my profession, that this shows up the most that I deal with, and I've certainly worked on my own thought process over the years, and continue to, but where you see that it can be really harmful to have this entity-based type of thinking, where there is a certain finite entity that we're trying to look for, and we judge it as good or bad, right or wrong, as opposed to look at things from a more process or continuum-based way, where there's varying degrees and there's varying relationships that will actually have an effect on something we want to change. And oftentimes that is, the bottom line of when someone's coming in to see a movement professional, they want to change something. So they either want to get more fit, they want to get out of pain, they want to change a behavior, something they want to change. They might not realize they want to change, but that is ultimately the goal. And in order to start the process of change, you have to realize that it's not going to be a quick process oftentimes. And just the word process by nature kind of indicates that there isn't a fix or a cure, but it is an ongoing journey that we're about to undertake. So if we can have an idea that most things that we want to change and most things that we might be uncomfortable with in our life, they fall within a continuum of good or bad, or stuff that is useful or not useful in our life, it can be really helpful for many reasons. So the first place that this shows up, and the most common thing I see, is with pain and then diagnosis. And diagnosis usually is referring to structural diagnosis of some entity in the body, some structure in the body that has become damaged, and then this is leading to pain. And there's really a seeking of this out whenever anyone is in pain, that there has to be a very direct cause to the pain. And that cause has to be something that you can identify within the body. And oftentimes we're looking for the simplicity of a single structure, something we can name. And right off the bat, that leads to a search that might not be fruitful. And then this search can then lead to chronicity of pain. So to look at one's pain or one's symptom in a continuum of some of the things that might be occurring in our lives is a much better and more skillful way of trying to actually make change to that pain. All right, and this is backed up by quite a bit of research that's just looking at, like, what is the nature of pain, and it is not a thing, but it's more of a process, and it's a process that's very person specific, tied into the biology of an individual. So structure certainly plays a role, but so does psychology and social factors, and we can't really separate those out in how we look at pain. It's not that it's one, then the other, then the other. It's really they're always interplaying with each other at all times. So if we appreciate that there's always multiple variables at play with somebody's symptom and pain, then we can appreciate that we have to look at things in this sort of gradual spectrum model. And what that means is when we have something that brings on some symptoms, then we want to know, we don't want to look at the thing that's bringing on the symptom as good or bad. We want to look at it as why in this moment is it creating something that I want to change? And then what we can do is instead of trying to label it as bad and throw it away, we can find out where we can turn the volume down. I think a really good analogy for the difference continuum-based thinking and entity-based thinking is the volume knob versus the on-off switch. So the volume knob is more of this idea of the continuum. I could turn things down a little bit. I could turn things all the way down. But as I turn it down, I want to turn it down gradually. And I want to really be curious about the minimum effective dose that I need to turn something down in order to change the symptom, the complaint, oftentimes the pain. So if we have that model in our head, then we don't have to really throw anything away. We can just look to modify, and we're using the pain and the symptom as our ultimate determinant of what we should and shouldn't do. And this is very different than trying to seek out some type of label for what's wrong with us, what's broken within us, and that as soon as we find that label, well, somebody else will fix us because they'll know what to do. And that's in many ways what our orthopedic model is based on, is this model of just let's see inside the body, let's see what's broken inside of me, and then doc, what can you do to fix me? And you can make change with a lot of the interventions that are offered there. But what's really interesting, if you actually dive into the idea of finding a diagnosis, the diagnosis doesn't actually lead to a direct treatment in most cases. So if we really are going to look at inside the body and find some type of structural problem, the interventions that are offered for those structural problems don't actually fix the structure unless you go through a surgical process. But in most cases, that's the last line of treatment, and people get better all the time without any change to the structure. All right, so outside of physical therapy and movement processes, just the interventions that are offered are typically anti-inflammatory in nature, medicines that change the feeling within the body, usually change the inflammation that's within the body, but it's not actually changing the structure in the moment if we think of things as being torn or broken or damaged in different ways. So we sort of accept that already, but I don't think that the dots are always connected there, is that the interventions that are offered by many orthopedics, for the most part, aren't meant to change the structure, but they will change the pain. And then the interventions offered by the physical therapist or the movement professional, I think there is sometimes a misconception that they are attempting to change the structure, but in many ways they are also not meaning to change the structure. They're looking to change the function around the symptom. So to allow someone to do more with pain or have pain come on less frequently. But the idea is really looking at the function and what someone can do around the symptom, as opposed to looking to try to change anything within the body. I know I have no control over what's going on in someone's body, or I certainly can't assess it in real time and know what I'm changing within someone's body. What I can see is if I'm directly changing someone's function, I can ask and get subjective data on how much something might be hurting in any moment, and I can have a nice profile of someone's pain behavior with movement, with activity. And then I can get even a broader profile of someone's behavior throughout the course of their life and their day that would also have some effects on pain. So all of this goes to say that there's many, many relationships that are involved in someone getting a symptom, and none of it is a specific entity. So it certainly is useful to get out of that mindset of trying to search for one thing that's wrong or one thing that's broken when some type of symptom pops up. So very similarly, if we look at the movement world and we look at movement and exercise, there's this mentality of trying to break exercises down into safe or unsafe, maybe useful for strength training, but certainly you can't do them as you get older because they're going to be harmful for you. And that certainly, again, fits these exercises into certain entities as opposed to looking at them as processes that have many different variables, such as the dosage, how much volume you're doing, how much load you're doing. And I mean, it's always mind-boggling to me how you can see on social media, and I see this, I hear this from physicians all the time, that just don't do certain exercises with no other context. Don't deadlift, don't, lift weight more than 10 pounds. And there's no other context. There's no context of how much time you're going to take to build up to that, how much weight you're doing, what kind of implement you're lifting. It's just you're naming exercises and saying that they're bad for you. Don't go overhead. I mean, it's just harmful to give that type of information with no context, but it happens all the time. It's probably one of the most common things I hear the first time I meet somebody that's coming in for some type of injury. And the patient starts to take it on as obvious as like, oh yeah, I know I shouldn't go overhead. I know I shouldn't deadlift. It's bad for me. That without any thought process, because that's what they've been told by some type of healthcare professional. And the bottom line, like the crux of this issue is that we're looking at exercises as entities that have no continuum, have no process. So that's what, as a movement professional, we're always looking at that process and really should be movement agnostic and just look at, okay, what does the person need to get better at? What do they need to be able to do? And oftentimes the things that they need to be able to do might actually fit into the bucket or the category of what they're told not to do. And this can obviously become a problem, and it becomes something that as a physical therapist, you constantly have to negotiate bad advice from other physical therapists, by the way. But I think it always boils down to is that without the experience of assessing and trying different movements in your own practice, it's very easy to hear something and assume that something is bad or good for you, and then just take it at face value and never try it and not think deeper about it, not actually give it any context. And I think that happens quite a bit. So anything, in my experience, and going on almost 20 years now of working with people in pain, is that certainly anything can cause pain. I've worked with CrossFit athletes. I've been in CrossFit. I've worked with a lot of people who got injured doing yoga, Pilates, and I've done all these practices myself. And I could certainly see how doing anything too much or not the right dosage for the right person at the right moment can cause symptoms. But it is just irresponsible to just pinpoint certain movements without giving any context of dosage, psychology of the individual, sociology, any of that, and just saying that they're safe or unsafe. A similar conversation within the movement space would be certain equipment, footwear, clothing that is good or bad for you, that we kind of tie it into an extreme. And a common example is that supportive shoes are bad for you because they're going to make your feet weak. Well, in some circumstance, that could be true. If we are mindless with how we use supportive shoes, then yeah, I mean, if we never take them off, then they will probably atrophy our feet, right? So that's one concept that has no further context to it. And there's, again, no continuum, no process, no thinking that in some circumstances, supportive shoes might absolutely be the way to go. And in other circumstances, we have to be aware that it's okay to take the shoes off and get our feet to move. I'm certainly in favor of getting our feet to be stronger, having more proprioception, more awareness of the feet. But I've gone through this process myself where I was all gung-ho on the barefoot craze and tried to train for a 10-mile run in the Vibram Five Fingers and broke the top of my foot because I just wasn't ready. I didn't go through a process of getting myself more adapted. Now, there are plenty of people that could do that, but when we hear about these things as good and bad, what it forces people to do, what I've gone through myself, is you stop thinking about the process and you think about, oh, okay, I've been doing it wrong my whole life. Now I got to switch gears. I got to turn the light switch off. I got to go from wearing really supportive shoes to wearing no shoes. And then I'm going to go try and run a marathon. Bad things are going to happen there because we didn't go through a process. All right. So you can absolutely adapt to anything. And it's amazing if you watch some reality TV, you see some of these survivalists, what they adapt to and what the body is capable of. We can adapt to anything. We just have to go through that process, and that process cannot be rushed, right? So it has to be gradually turned up to build tolerance, or gradually turned down if we're not ready for it. But we have to be willing to always work within the continuum of what we're ready for at any moment. And that is different on every day. So this is where the concept of mindfulness, I think, really comes into play. Is the more we have a practice for mindfulness, the more we are aware of what we're ready for in any moment. And we really see that this concept of things being entities, things being inherently good or bad, it just falls apart as we have a mindfulness process where we look at everything is sort of somewhere in a relationship process, is in a place where it is not existing on its own. It needs causes and conditions and relationships for anything to exist in any moment. So, that can be deep, and that's its own type of philosophy. But with more mindfulness, you start to realize, certainly within your own movement, that we're capable of more than we think. We just may have to modify intensity, we may have to modify volume, and we may have to change sometimes our circumstances, our environment, so that we have more control on what we modify. But to assume, because we're a certain age, or because we have had pain in a certain area, that we either shouldn't do an exercise, or we should never wear a piece of equipment, or always wear a piece of equipment. And this just fits into this idea of things being inherently good or bad, and doesn't take into account a process. So the last thing I noticed this area come into, and it all fits into this health and fitness model, is behavior in general. So behavior, we can break this down into two basic areas. One, there is the nutrition component, where we look at foods as good or bad and have no real context behind why they might be good or bad. And where this becomes a problem is there's certainly foods that make it easy for us to consume them more. And I think you can even extend this conversation outside of nutrition into supplementation and even drugs, where the problem that you tend to see in society with certain foods, with certain drugs, is that if they are easy to overconsume, then they could become dangerous. And then there are certain foods and certain supplements and certain drugs even that are actually harder to overconsume. So once you get into that place, you can kind of see, all right, there's a little bit of a distinction there, where with no mindfulness whatsoever, no process whatsoever, certain foods are going to naturally be safer, while other foods will naturally be a little bit more unsafe, and we have to be more careful with. But that does not mean that we never go near those foods that might be a little bit overconsumed. And that might not even mean that there's not a place for drugs that, if you're not careful, can be very dangerous and you can overconsume them, right? And there is places for all of these things, but we have to have some type of process for knowing what we can control, what we're ready for. So I think within nutrition and, even within addiction, there is a need for an appreciation that some things, like, you just don't need to mess with, because you don't feel like you're comfortable trying to control a process. So you could just take it out of your life. And I've done that, with alcohol. I haven't had a drink in 15 years. But one of the things I've noticed, and one of the processes that I've gone through since giving up alcohol, is initially my mind went to, I have a something. I have an addictive personality. I am an alcoholic. I gave myself a diagnosis, an entity, and the world will give you a diagnosis. The social construct will give you a diagnosis. And sometimes the diagnosis can be useful if it keeps you from doing that behavior, and it puts you in an environment with other people that are helping you not do that behavior, then it can be useful. But if you start to believe it is true, and then that carries over to other things in your life, then I think it can become not so useful. And I started to notice that, where, okay, I'm an addictive personality, so now I got to give up sugar. I became a vegan, and there's nothing wrong with any of these things. I'm not trying to say that. It's just that eventually you got to draw a line. And instead of drawing a line at what entity you have a problem with and what you don't. You just can actually go back to the drawing board and say, maybe the whole idea of an addictive personality doesn't really exist. Maybe it's just there's certain things that aren't useful in your life, and there's certain things you might not want to give up and because they help you. But there's always this process where other people might be able to have a process where they can moderate fine with certain things, and that there might actually be some uses for some of these things that you're giving up. So if you just claim that, okay, I need to give up sugar, well, now you're going to start looking at anyone that's consuming sugar as that they're doing something unhealthy, where there's actually many times where sugar has a very direct use for nutrition and supporting a healthy lifestyle, right? So we have to look at it as what is the intention of the thing that you're doing in any one moment. And certainly one's situation of where they find useful isn't going to carry over to another person's situation. And if you take a concept that it may work with one food product, with one drug, and then you extrapolate that into everything in your life, what you're going to start to find is anytime you have a problem, you're going to blame yourself, you're going to blame your diagnosis, as opposed to trying to look at it more directly at what you can change in any one moment. And I think this is something I've certainly learned, and I see this a lot with clients, is when they're trying to make changes with nutrition, guilt will follow, and then some type of labeling of what they feel they are follows. So a judgment about themselves, guilt, and then a feeling of helplessness is what I see, because that there's some type of sense that there's nothing I can do about this because this is the way that I am. And I can't believe that. And I haven't seen that to be true. I haven't seen evidence for that to be true, but I feel like that is a very pervasive thought process when we start to think about things as entities, as opposed to thinking of things as processes. Hopefully that was coherent. Hopefully that's something I'm certainly passionate about, but I think it can be a little bit of a tricky topic. So if you just take one thing from this discussion and think about the light switch versus the volume knob, and if we can keep many of the things in our life that we want to change more in a volume knob mentality, that we can gradually turn the volume up, gradually turn the volume down, I think we're going to be in a much better position to make change. And we're going to be a lot more patient with ourselves. I think patience is a huge part of this. Oftentimes when we want to change something, we want to change it now. And certainly when we're in pain, we want to get out of pain as quickly as we can. So it's easier to think in many ways of, let me find the entity that I can quickly change, the entity that wasn't there before, that when I was pain-free, I need to excise this entity from myself, as opposed to looking at it, well, pain maybe was a response to many relationships that were already going on. And can we play around with some of those relationships? And can we have more education on those relationships as we go? So if pain comes back, which it usually does in different manners, that we have a way to view it, that we can work with it and we can change it without feeling like we need to search for the thing to cure. And I think that's so important. And then on the other side of this coin, for all of these discussions, whether it's pain, movement, or behavior, if we want to get more tolerant to things, this concept of tolerance is building the ability to be able to experience higher intensities, experience more volume, experience longer durations, and even not notice some discomforts that we would have typically noticed, to be able to go through more and do more before we actually notice things that would have been previously uncomfortable. This idea of building tolerance, you need to have this continuum-based thinking. This is the basic tenets of trying to promote adaptation in the body. So getting more tolerant to heavier weights, getting more tolerant to running longer, getting more tolerant to being able to go longer without food, be able to be more tolerant to tastes and foods that we might not have liked when we were younger, or we might have to start eating some foods or drinking maybe more water, things that we are just very plain and bland to us. Well, we can get more tolerant to that if we think about it as this gradual process. as opposed to thinking of it as like, no, I just don't like that. That's not for me. Everything I feel like has this gradual process where we can get more tolerant, we can get better at things. And that only comes if we have a mentality of saying that we can gradually change things and that there is a gradual process, not just an entity of this is how I am. I'll see you next time.